On behalf of the library and the series planning committee, thank you for joining us for our final Death and Dying event for 2020. Compounding our sorrow, grieving during a pandemic. I'll make some introductory remarks as we give some other attendees a couple of minutes to join the event. This is our 4th year hosting the Death and Dying series, and we feel it's especially important that we offer the series this year to give people the opportunity to start conversations on these important topics as we face the challenges brought on by the pandemic. Bravo to those of you in attendance this evening for starting this conversation. We also want to say thank you to the Hospice Foundation of the Ozarks for funding our series of virtual events, along with new materials about end-of-life topics for the library's collection. We value the support they provide for the Death and Dying series and end-of-life projects in our community. We appreciate you joining us to help break the taboo of talking about death and start a community conversation on end-of-life topics. We hope this event and the Death and Dying series as a whole inspires you to continue the conversation that we start here with the people in your life. As I mentioned, this is our final event for the 2020 series. If you missed this event, or if you want to watch or miss the other events or want to rewatch them, or rewatch this one, you're welcome to share them with friends and family. We'll be having links to the videos out on our YouTube channel, Springfield-Greene, in the next week or so. This session will be added to that channel as soon as I'm able to. So if you're interested in reading on death and dying topics, the materials I mentioned, then you can find a book list of those at thelibrary.org/death. Those are also on bookmarks available at the branches right now. Before we get started with the presentation, a reminder that the library continues to offer programs for adults and children. They're just in a virtual format for the time being. Our program schedule is available online at thelibrary.org/programs. If you'd like to receive emails about upcoming library programs tailored to your interests, topical book lists, or library news, please visit thelibrary.org/newsletter to sign up for periodic updates. You'll be the first to know about library events, and the event emails make handy reminders. One more bit of housekeeping. Please keep your mic muted throughout the presentation. We want to make sure you can hear our presenters clearly. We'll have time for Q&A at the end, so feel free to share your questions and your comments anytime via the Q&A or chat functions. Our panelists can see them, be monitoring them, and they'll answer your questions, if not throughout, then at the end. If you encounter technical difficulties, please let us know in the chat. My coworker, Chrissy Seiner, is our Zoom master this evening and will provide us with tech support as we need it. Thank you, Chrissy, for your time this evening. We're so pleased again that you could join us for Compounding Our Sorrow, Grieving During the Pandemic with Lost and Found Grief Center. Our presenters are Nanette Thomas and Sarah Brown, program coordinators at Lost and Found. They are very well versed on the topic of grief and assisting those who are grieving. We are delighted that they are here to help us start this conversation and understand what we can expect to feel and experience when grieving the deaths of family, friends, and coworkers during this challenging time, providing tips to help us cope. Thank you, Nanette and Sarah, for sharing your expertise with us this evening.
Thank you so much for having us. My name is Nanette, and I am a program coordinator, as Sarah mentioned. Sarah Brown is also joining us. She's gonna just be kind of taking care of any questions that you have throughout. She'll be compiling a list, and then we'll address them at the end of our presentation. So I'm so glad that you all are with us tonight. I wanna talk just a little bit about well, first of all, I guess I could say this is me. I went to school at Evangel University. I'm from Springfield, Missouri, and I really fell in love, if that's even possible, with grief work as soon as I found out about Lost and Found. When I was 13 years old, my brother was killed in a car accident, and unfortunately, Lost and Found didn't exist then. It was formed just a few years after that experience, and as I was in college, I found out about Lost and Found, and I just knew how pivotal it would be for families and individuals to have somewhere that they could come together with other people who are going through something similar. So I have been at Lost and Found in this role for 8.5 years. I'm really humbled that I get to be there and do work that I'm so passionate about. And I live here in Springfield, Missouri with my 2 daughters and my husband. Sarah is also joining us, as I mentioned, and we're lucky to have her at Lost and Found. I wanted to start with this quote I found. I think it's really good to just start with this thought as we begin tonight. Sometimes we try not to feel what we're feeling, because we have this image of a gang of feelings. If I feel sad and let that in, it'll never go away. The gang of bad feelings will overrun me. And the truth is that a feeling moves through us. We feel it and it goes, and then we go to the next feeling. There's no gang out to get us. It's absurd to think we shouldn't feel grief right now. Let yourself feel the grief and keep going. Sometimes, we've talked about this a lot at work, sometimes we have this idea that we shouldn't, that people don't want to feel sad because they're worried if they lean into that sadness at all, they'll never stop feeling sad. If they cry a little bit, they'll never stop crying. And what we know is that when you actually feel those feelings and you lean into them, you move through those feelings, you work through those feelings, and there's actually there's moving on in the next feeling because you don't ever feel something all the time. I think this is such a great picture of what grief is like. The experience of grief is unfortunately not at all what we want it to be like. There is no linear process in grief. It's really all over the place. And actually, if I would have had time and the tech savvy know-how, I would have made another picture of this and just added lots of colored scribbles all over the entire page and said, that's the experience of grief during a pandemic. Because as difficult and confusing and challenging as grief is during normal times, it is much more so during pandemic times. And hopefully we can unpack that a little bit tonight and at least give some language to maybe what you're experiencing. Before we even start talking about grief in a pandemic, I think that it's important that we all get on the same page about what grief is like in our society and what we mean when we talk about grief and our responses to grief. So first of all, just talking about death in our society, we have pretty unhealthy responses overall. Now, that doesn't mean everyone does, and some people are much better with bereavement than others, but overall in our society, I think we have to acknowledge that we're a pretty death-denying society. We never want to talk about it. We don't want to think about it. And for most people, there's some limited exposure. So they haven't firsthand experienced it. And so that creates this real discomfort of talking about it. It makes it feel uncomfortable, like you're going to say the wrong thing, or maybe you don't even know where to start the conversation, which is probably why you're here tonight. I think the other thing is that when we see death happen in shows or in movies, it typically is a pretty unrealistic depiction of what death is actually like. And so that really inhibits us from being able to establish some realistic expectations of what death should look like, what bereavement should look like, how we should comfort those who are grieving or journey with them through their grief journey. And, kind of going on to that, I think that we all have heard, or maybe if we were in person, I would ask you to respond to this, but the time frame of how long it should be until people are back at work, are back at functioning at their normal level, are back to normal. And I say it like that because we know that there is no returning to normal, but we live in this society that we have a quick fix mentality about everything. We have access to things in no time at all, and we're used to that. We're used to being able to order something online and having it at our doorstep the next day, or being able to cook a meal in 30 seconds in the microwave. And so we have this expectation that when we're grieving, it shouldn't be that different. It shouldn't last as long as it does. And, most people that we serve at Lost and Found will say, they went back to work maybe a couple weeks after a loss. And a lot of people 6 weeks in have a conversation with their employer and they say, you're not performing at the level you were before. What's going on? Well, of course they're not, because everything in their world has changed. And that affects, not one part of your life, but all of your life. And so we see those time frames, those, pretend time frames being imposed on people in their grief journey. Another thing is there's really a lack of understanding about how grief affects not just adults, but children and the whole family dynamic. There's a lot of people that would say, well, kids don't really grieve. They absolutely grieve. It just looks really different from adults. And so, we need to do a better job of knowing what that looks like. And then there's a lack of knowledge because of that limited exposure that we talked about of how to support and comfort grieving people. And because of all of those things, typically bereaved individuals become kind of isolated because they don't know where to get that support that they need, and people don't know how to offer it. So the last thing that they can think to do is to ask for what they need because they don't know, and it feels difficult. Some myths and misconceptions about grief is that we should keep quiet. Don't talk about your grief because it's going to make other people uncomfortable, and we wouldn't want to do that. Those time frames that I just mentioned, that your grief should be over quickly, that within a year you should be moving forward, moving on, being back to normal, that you can just get over it, that grief is just something that everybody does. You can pull yourself up by your bootstraps and move forward, that you go back to normal. As I mentioned before, there really is no going back to normal, because when someone in your family or a loved one dies, kind of everything in your world changes. So that normal you had before, that equilibrium's off. There is no going back to that. And that you should just maybe keep busy. That if you stay busy enough, that'll mask the pain that you're feeling, and that eventually that pain will just subside. Or maybe you should just continue with no changes. Really, none of those ideas work. And so we have to do better as a society, figuring out how we can move through the pain of grief. So really, what is grief? Grief is a normal response when someone you love dies. That's what we're talking about tonight. It is different for every person, because your grief is really determined by your relationship with the deceased person. So it isn't just, it's not just that someone in your family died, but it's the relationship that each person had with the deceased individual. There isn't a timetable for grieving. It's different for every person, and the journey is different for each person until they feel like they've kind of, found a new reality and been able to they help people learn how to talk about it. There's normally someone who's leading that group. In our groups, there's always a group coordinator that leads them, that has a master's level in counseling. But they lead that discussion. They help people understand, kind of have a starting point, and then being able to hear other people's experiences and linking is so valuable. And there's just this shared experience and shared understanding. This is so true, how grief really works. We want grief to be so linear. We want to know that there are steps, that there's a beginning and there's an ending. But how grief actually works is not linear at all. There is no step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. Grief is all over the place. If you've experienced a loss, you know that one day you might feel like you're doing really well, that you've maybe even kind of started to move forward with hope and feel like life is going to be okay again. And then maybe the next day something really hits you and you feel all over again, overwhelmed with the loss that you've experienced. And so grief, unfortunately, many days feels like it's, 3 steps forward, 4 steps back, whatever that saying is, that you really, sometimes you feel like you're not making progress, but you are. There are 2 main responses of grief when we talk about grief. And normally we think about emotional responses, which is what we're going to talk about first. The emotional responses of grief are shock. I can't believe this happened. I never saw it coming. Even for people who are anticipating a death, sometimes there is just the shock that it happened. Obviously, sadness, because someone that you love has died. Depression, that's, taking that even a step further. Anxiety, worrying about and having fear of what if something happens to another person that I love. Guilt. I wish I would have done something different. I wish I would have said something different. I wish we would have had one more conversation about this or that. Feeling anger or tension, and even a loss of confidence. All of those are normal emotional responses of grief. And then in addition to those emotional responses that we often think of when we think about our response to grief, there are also physical responses that are very real. Physical pains, headaches, stomach aches, changes in appetite, difficulty concentrating, absent-mindedness, a difficulty sleeping. Sometimes people try to mask those things with substance abuse. All of those things are just as real as those feelings that individuals feel when they're grieving. And when you think about them going back and functioning in a way that feels normal, that feels like it was before, you really have to look at all those things and think, how could someone who's feeling these things, the emotional response of grief, and then also the physical response, go back to the normal that they knew before? It's nearly impossible. And I think that knowing all of those things and giving language to them is really helpful as we talk through what it means to be grieving right now. Grief during a pandemic, this ball of grief, this tangled ball of emotions. I don't know how well you guys can see it. I know it's a little bit blurry, a little bit pixelated, but I think even if you can't read any of the words that are on that ball and you look at those different strands, if you're grieving, you can probably think of dozens of different emotions or physical responses that you're having to grief right now. And so grief is not holding one ball of sadness. It's just not. It's more like this tangled web. And actually, this is kind of what I think it is like. It's all connected, it's all together, and it's really difficult to be able to pull out one piece of it. It doesn't work like that. Everything is really tangled together. And so I think one thing that's really helpful is having people there to walk alongside you and to help kind of parse out all of those different pieces of grief, because this really is the experience of grief, especially right now. So I think, as we're approaching this, what makes grief so different during a pandemic? Is it that different, or is it just like it was before? Anticipatory grief, typically when we talk about it, is talking about the grief that happens before you experience the death of a loved one. Maybe your loved one has a diagnosis, that the death is imminent, and that grief that you feel just with that knowledge, that's what we normally talk about with anticipatory grief. It's actually less understood and less talked about by people because we normally think of grief just in terms of after a death has occurred, then you start grieving. But I think that this anticipatory grief, this is still happening for so many people, by the way, because they have a loved one who is terminally ill. But in addition to that, everyone right now, grieving or not, is feeling this sense of anticipatory grief about the pandemic. How long is it going to last? How many people is it going to affect? When is there going to be a better answer? Is this going to affect the economy? Is it going to affect my family personally? Are we going to get sick? Is anybody I love going to get sick? How are we going to take care of everyone? There are so many questions that happen just when you think about a pandemic in general, because we haven't lived through anything like this before. I know that people in general have, but we haven't. And so we don't really have a roadmap for what this should look like from our own personal experiences. We're all experiencing it together for the first time. And I think that it's really helpful to think about that if you're grieving on top of the grief that you experience, you have this level of just anticipatory grief about life in general right now. And I think that that's so important as you are considering why you might feel so exhausted, why you might feel so anxious, why you might feel overwhelmed right now. This is it. It's the grief that we're all experiencing right now, just in general from the pandemic. And then today, my colleague Sarah Brown and I were talking, and before today I had lack of closure listed here. And what I meant was just that when someone you love is in the hospital, and whether it's due to COVID or something else, and you're not able to be with them, and you're not able to have those conversations that you wanted to have, but really there's not closure that we think of in that way. But there is this sense of a lack of connection that so many people are unable to visit individuals who are in nursing homes or residential facilities or in hospitals. And that's so difficult because they were used to this level of connection prior for residential facilities or nursing homes. If you were a caregiver and you put your loved one in a nursing home, to not be able to be there each day with them, to not be able to spend time feeding them. In fact, last night, Sarah was sharing with me earlier today that last night in one of our caregiver groups, they were talking about how they used to go in every day and they would spend time feeding their loved one. It takes a really long time, but they were willing to spend that time doing that each day. And now, because of the different regulations that are there, they're unable to do that. They're unable to have that connection. And the ramifications are not just emotional for them, but that their loved one is actually deteriorating pretty quickly physically as well. And so a big part of this is this lack of connections, the lack of connection that people are able to have when someone just gets sick. And I think this is actually true even for joyful times. Whenever a new life is brought into the world and visitors aren't able to go see them, that creates grief too. It's this overwhelming sense of some connection is being removed from our normal life right now. And that kind of leads to unresolved feelings. we always hope to have those beautiful conversations, those beautiful moments with a loved one. If we knew that a loved one was sick or was in a care facility, we want to be able to have all those meaningful conversations, to say everything that we really want to be able to say. And not being able to have that connection, it can create all of these unresolved feelings that you have now, because you wish that you would have said things differently. You wish that you could have resolved things a little bit more than you were able to. And so instead, we're left with those feelings behind that we really wish that we would have said things differently. And there's a lack of normal commemoration. I know earlier in the Death and Dying series, you had someone from a funeral home that was sharing about what the funeral process looks like right now. And I think it's different for a lot of different places, but regardless, there's this lack of normal commemoration. And why is it so important to commemorate the life of a loved one? It's important because it is honoring and acknowledging the impact that that life has had on you and had on others. When you go to a memorial service or funeral, to hear the stories of different people and how they were connected to the loved one that has died is so meaningful. You learn things about that person that you didn't know before. You hear those stories, and to have that lack of normal commemoration where you don't get the chance to hear those things and to know that all these other people are standing in grief with you, it is so it is so impactful for someone to miss out on that. I actually had a friend whose spouse died early the week that quarantine started. Her spouse died, and so they weren't able to have a funeral back then, and they ended up doing something that was different and COVID friendly and months later. And after that day, although it was really difficult to visit those feelings, and it didn't make the grief go away, but it was really meaningful. It was meaningful to see all of those people come in and to share support and to sense that connection. And the normal commemoration is beyond just having the actual funeral, but for people to be able to hug you, to be able to touch you, to be able to just hold your hand and to share with you what they're thinking and how they're thinking of you. Those things are steps removed right now, and that has an impact on grieving individuals. And again, that leads to an inability to receive support. There are studies that show just about the power of safe touch, that holding a safe person's hand has a physical response, that it lowers anxiety, that it increases oxytocin and endorphins, that those things that we think they're just nice gestures, there's a biological response whenever someone reaches out to hold your hand when you're crying, when you're grieving. And those types of things really are more absent right now. And they have an impact, not just emotionally, but physically too, because people don't have that lowering of anxiety. They don't have those endorphins that they might get from connection. And so that inability to receive support is really real. And that furthers their isolation. Even after the memorial service or the funeral, there is a lot of fear right now. And there's no judgment about it, but people are concerned about being indoors. They're concerned about not being masked. And all of those things are so valid. And so I understand all of those emotions. I'm not saying that anyone should do anything differently than what they are, but because of that, it does isolate people. I don't know if you all are familiar with a film from 2007 called Lars and the Real Girl. It had Ryan Gosling in it. And it's an interesting film, but my favorite part of the film is it's close to the end. So I don't want to give away anything, but I'm going to. It's been 13 years. So if you haven't seen it yet, I'm going to give a little bit of a spoiler alert. Lars is going through something really hard and sad. And he's sitting on the couch, and there are these elderly ladies from the community that have come over to his house. They've brought casseroles, they've brought their knitting, and he says, I don't know what I should do. And they say, you eat. We came over to sit. That's what people do when tragedy strikes. And I think it is such a beautiful picture of what community is, of what connection is. It's what I hope for every grieving individual. And right now, it's just not a realistic possibility. And so even just having the presence of a person with you when there aren't words to say, that is so comforting. It's so helpful. But right now we don't have that exactly. And so there is this continued isolation as people are grieving. And then kind of going back to that anticipatory grief piece, there's this added stress and worry of all the things that are unknown right now. If life feels unknown after a death, it feels much more so right now, just because in addition to not knowing what life is going to be like later, we don't know what life is going to be like with this pandemic, or how long it's going to last, or what all the ramifications are from the pandemic. And so there is this element of added stress and worry. As we go through all of those things, it's important to kind of take a step back and say, well, how do we work through grief? What does that mean? And I really don't think that there's a magical formula that's different right now than what we would say normally. Worden's Psychological Tasks of Grieving is one of my favorite models that we use in talking about what it means to work through grief. That there aren't stages to grief, but instead there are tasks that you approach as you're grieving. And so each one of these tasks are things that, although there are numbers next to them, there isn't, you do task 1, you're finished with it, you move to task 2. In fact, these could be going on simultaneously. You could be on task 4 one day and then go back to task 1. So the first task that he talks about is just acceptance or understanding, just trying to make sense of the death and even understanding that your loved one has died. That's the first task of grieving. And it seems like, well, that should happen on day 1. But as you go through life, you always come back to that. How did that happen? How did my loved one die? I can't believe they're not here for X, Y, or Z. And then the second one is grieving, simply dealing with all of the feelings that you have and the symptoms of grief. Again, those things, they ebb and flow over time. There are days that your grief might feel very intense, and then other days that it's not as much. And then commemoration, finding ways to acknowledge the loss and to remember your loved one. So the first thing that we think of, obviously, is a funeral service or a memorial service. But throughout life, there are ways that you go back to commemorate your loved one. And then the fourth one is moving forward, going on. And how do you incorporate the loss that you've experienced into your life, and at the same time, reinvest in life and move forward with a sense of hope? And just, again, as I said before, these aren't tasks that you do one at a time, or that you mark each one of them off and then you're finished with them, but they're that when you experience the death of a loved one, these are tasks that you interact with really forever. And the intensity that you might experience them with is different, but they're still really important to consider. So I want to spend just a few moments, and I know we're almost out of time, but how we deal with grief. I think the first thing to think about is to let go of doing it right. There are so many families that we talk with, and when they call us, they say, we just want to make sure we get it right. We want to make sure that we're doing the best we can for our child, for our marriage, for me individually. And the reality is, and this is what Sarah says all the time, there are lots of ways to do it right and only a few ways to do it wrong. Meaning isolating yourself from everyone, giving up on life, covering things up with substance abuse. Those are wrong ways to grieve, but there are lots of ways to do it right, and it's going to look different for every single person. So give yourself grace as you're trying to figure out what it means to grieve in the right way. Only you're going to know that, and you're going to be able to determine if you're doing that. The second thing, I love this idea of taking an inventory. It's from Megan Devine shared it in her book, It's Okay That You're Not Okay. And the idea is that you take an inventory of your day, that at different parts of your day, you maybe journal how you're feeling in that moment. And it seems almost silly to sit down because you can recall those emotions. But what she's talking about is, I was in the grocery store today. It was really crowded. I felt very anxious and stressed the whole time I was there. I cried when I got back in my car because I saw my loved one's favorite cereal. Okay, well, maybe you should go to grocery pickup from now on. That's an easy thing that you can eliminate. And then on the other side, what are times that I felt wellness, that I felt like I was doing okay? I went to someone's house for dinner. I was able to help in the kitchen. And although I was around people, I didn't have to have direct conversation. It felt good to not be alone. And that way, when you take that inventory, you can refer back to it. It almost takes out some of that emotional energy that you have to, as you're making decisions, if you feel up for something or not, it takes some of that out. Practicing mindfulness is really simple. If I was going to show you something that we did with kids, it would probably be 5-finger breathing. You simply are just focusing on the present moment. You're focusing on what you can control, and you can do it with something so simple like breath. 5-finger breathing is something that you can do where you take a deep breath in as you go up and blow out as you go down, and in as you go up. And so you do that, and you can do it as many times as you want. You can put your leg or your hand on your leg during a meeting. You can do it while you're in a meeting. And that actually has a biological response as well. It creates new neurons, neural connections in your brain, which help with resilience. And it also helps to lower your blood pressure, to calm you down, and to reduce some anxiety as well. Focus on relieving suffering. There is no getting around grief. There's no, I wish there was a magic way that we could make it not hurt for people. But it hurts because it mattered. It hurts because you loved the person who died. And there's nothing that anyone can say or do to remove the pain that you feel from losing your loved one. But in brief moments, what can help reduce the suffering that you feel? And I put things small because sometimes we think, I wish I had a day without pain. I wish I had a day where I didn't feel it. Instead, think about for the next 5 minutes. Maybe that's too long. In the next minute, what can I do that's going to relieve some of the suffering that I'm experiencing? And I think as you continue to focus on those small reprieves from suffering, or if you're supporting someone that's grieving, thinking about maybe I'm going to take them something small just for joy to be there for just a few moments of their day. Those things matter so much. They're so valuable. And then lean into wellness. This is another idea from It's Okay That You're Not Okay. But the idea that any time that you feel things that are helping you be well, whether it's drinking more water, if it's being outside and just spending time getting fresh air, if it's having a good conversation with someone, lean into those things. Even if, again, they're small, little distinctions throughout your day, they're important and they matter. And the last one, obviously, you knew that I couldn't be from Lost and Found and passionate about support groups and not talk to you about finding support, but finding your support. If you're in the Springfield area, then of course reach out to Lost and Found. But maybe you're not, and maybe you want support in another way. Of course, just find the kind of support that is helpful to you, because no one should have to grieve alone. It is an isolating and difficult journey, and no one's really meant to do it on their own. So finding that connection with other people is vital in learning to deal with your grief. This is a quote from that book that I just love. It says, sometimes with the small amount of energy you have, and I'm going to put a side note in here, because think back to all the emotional responses of grief, all of physical responses of grief, and just trying to assimilate into life without your loved one. Of course, you have limited energy. The only thing you can do is heave yourself in the direction of wellness. Heave yourself in the direction of gentleness to yourself. I'm going to read that part again. Heave yourself in the direction of gentleness to yourself. You don't have to do any more than that. Just turn towards it. Turn towards wellness, and that's enough. It counts. So as you feel pressure to make big changes, as you feel pressure to figure out big steps that you can do, think small. Lean into those moments of wellness. Be gentle with yourself, because grief is it's a journey that no one wants to have to go on. It's exhausting. But all of those little moments that you lean into wellness, they matter and they count. I want to just spend a few moments talking about Lost and Found, and then I want to answer any questions that if anyone has them. But Lost and Found, we're located at 1555 South Glenstone. We exist because we believe that every person deserves to have the opportunity to grieve in a supportive and understanding environment. We know that grief is a natural response when someone you love dies, that within each person, there's a capacity to heal oneself. Grief is a normal part of life. It's something that most everyone experiences. We know that the duration and intensity of grief are unique for each individual. All those factors that we talked about at the beginning, they matter. But we also know just that having a caring presence assists in that journey, and that's why we're here. Our mission is that we strive to improve lives in our community by providing help, hope, and healing through professional grief support services. So who we serve, I'm just going to say this briefly. Of course, you can find more information on our website, etc. We serve children as young as 4 through 18. Those groups are divided by age. We have a 4 to 6-year-old group, an elementary age group, middle school, high school. And then while all of those groups meet, there's a concurrent parent or caregiver group that meets in just a separate part of our building. We also have a young adult group for 18 to 30-year-olds. Adults, we divide the adult groups up based on the type of loss that they've experienced. So spouse loss, child loss, adult child loss, and then just a general loss group for adults. We also have journey support, which I mentioned just briefly before. I think those groups are for individuals who have a loved one who has a life-altering illness. And so there is a caregiver group right now, Sarah, who is on this call as well. She leads that group. We also offer crisis support. So for families, medical personnel, professionals, businesses, just a couple of weeks ago, I had a business reach out to us that had employees who had experienced the death of a loved one. They had multiple employees, actually, and they wanted all of their other employees to be able to access some resources to know how to support those bereaved individuals when they came back. So that would be a type of crisis support that we offer. And then obviously we offer education just like we are tonight. So we do presentations, we have social media that we offer articles and just quotes, different things on our social media that I think are really helpful. And then website and publications. On our website, we have a resources tab and we have various articles that are there that are really helpful, as well as links to some other publications. We do provide high quality professional services. So there's a master's degree coordinator that oversees each of our groups. Our groups are very structured. They're trauma-informed care, they're therapeutic in nature, and we really address the entire family dynamic as we're going through our activities in group, because we know that if we address the whole family, everyone is going to move forward in their grief in a more healthy way. And we have a forward-moving model to help individuals as they enter this new reality that they're living in now in their grief. I'm going to try to share this in the chat box. These are just some links that I think are really helpful articles, kind of to normalize grief, and then also grief during a pandemic. They give some good language to what we've talked about tonight. And this is our website. Info at lostandfoundozarks.com if you have questions that wouldn't be appropriate to address here tonight. And that's basically it. I don't know if there are questions, if there are things that I can help with. Has it been pretty quiet in the chat, Sarah?
I'm not seeing any questions on my screen.
Okay. If anybody does have questions right now, would be a great time. I'd love to answer them, or Sarah's also available to answer questions, and she'd be glad to do so as well. Oh, go ahead, Sarah. You want to answer that while I...
It's okay that you're not okay. And I actually have a copy of it right here. This is what it looks like.
And I will say, although I mentioned that book tonight, and I think that it does have some helpful aspects. Obviously, I shared several quotes and things from it tonight. That's what we're reading right now as a staff at Lost and Found. But I think that there are several other books that might be even more helpful if you're, sorry, I'm trying to copy those things off, that might be more helpful as you're grieving. One book that we actually just finished reading as a staff that we all really, really liked was called Finding Meaning. It's by David Kessler. And I think that it would be a great one to check out if you're looking for a book that might be helpful as you're grieving. Okay, and I just sent a link of all of those articles. I don't know if there's, if there's something that you're interested in, obviously you could copy and paste those, and it might be something helpful in there. I don't know.
I just checked the catalog, and we do have Finding Meaning in the library catalog. If someone's interested in checking that out, it actually looks like it's on the shelf right now.
Guys, go on your library account right now and reserve it. It's a great book. David Kessler, just as some fun background, David Kessler worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who is well known for the 5 stages of grief, which is actually talking about anticipatory grief when she was talking about those rather than grief following the death of a loved one. But he, with her permission, he asked if he could expound on the work she had already done. He worked with her for many years, and she agreed to that. And he said, really, there's a 6th stage of grief, and it's finding meaning in it. And he wrote that book after the death of his own son. And so, what he's sharing is not just from a clinician, but it's also from a very personal standpoint. So he has just a beautiful combination of experience professionally and also personally. And I think it's a really valuable read.
Well, thank you for sharing all the resources in the chat. Also, those are great to have, and I will copy them so that I can include them with our post when I put this up on YouTube.
Perfect.
And if you would like to share this or would like to watch it again, it'll be on our YouTube channel probably in the next week or so, which is youtube.com/Springfield-Greene.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for organizing this again, Sarah. We sure appreciate it.
It's our pleasure. And thank you so much, Nina and Sarah. We really appreciate your time this evening. And I always think it's a wonderful reminder to give ourselves grace and be gentle with ourselves. Now it's more important than ever.
It is. That's right. And it's, it takes work to lean into those things because we tend to be really hard on ourselves and expect too much of ourselves when we're not grieving. So especially more so when we are. And it's really important, just that gentleness to self.
Dorsey says, thank you very much. She didn't have a question, but she wanted to thank you for participating. So if we were at the library, we would all be applauding you right now. So thank you very, very much for your time and your guidance as we all try and make it through this time. Thank you again to the Hospice Foundation of the Ozarks for providing financial support for the Death and Dying series. And thank you to our viewers for attending our virtual event this evening. For those of you who have experienced a loss this year due to COVID or another cause, we extend our deepest condolences and hope this program helps you find comfort. Thank you all and have a wonderful evening.